Finance requires aggressive personalities. That's what my brother Troy said when he terminated my partnership. Just like that. 23 years building Shepherd Capital Holdings, and he cut me loose with a handshake and corporate speak. My name is Colin Shepherd. I'm 41, and until last week I was senior partner at the investment firm my dad started in our garage back in 1987. Troy's 39, 2 years younger, but he's been acting like the heir apparent since he learned to walk. Dad always said Troy had the killer instinct for high finance. Me? I was the steady hand, the one clients trusted with their retirement funds and their kids' college money. Troy had been circling this moment for months. Ever since Dad announced he was stepping back from day-to-day operations, Troy started making moves, brought in 2 outside investors, restructured the partnership agreements, held meetings I wasn't invited to. The writing was on the wall, but I kept my head down and did my job. 23 years of client relationships don't just disappear because your little brother gets ambitious. The morning he called me into the conference room, I knew what was coming. Troy sat behind Dad's old desk like he'd been born to it, wearing a suit that cost more than most people make in a month. The 2 outside investors flanked him like bodyguards. "Colin, we need to talk about your role moving forward," he started. I sat across from him in the same chair where I'd pitched my first client presentation 15 years ago. The leather was worn smooth from all the nervous executives who'd sat there before me, hoping we could save their companies from bankruptcy or grow their family trusts into something their grandchildren would thank them for. "The firm's evolving," Troy continued. "We're moving into more aggressive investment strategies, cryptocurrency portfolios, high-yield derivatives, venture capital partnerships, the kind of plays that require a certain mindset." He paused, watching my face for a reaction. I didn't give him one. "You're brilliant with the conservative clients, Colin, but that's yesterday's market. Today's wealth builders want growth, not safety." I knew where this was heading, but I let him finish his speech. 23 years of partnership, and he couldn't even give me the courtesy of honesty. He had to dress it up in business jargon and market analysis. When he finally got to the point about terminating my role, I stood up and extended my hand. "I understand," I said. "Aggression can be effective." Troy shook my hand, probably expecting a fight or at least some pushback. Instead, I walked out of that conference room and started making phone calls. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. Building Shepherd Capital wasn't just my career, it was my life. Dad started the firm when I was 18, fresh out of high school and hungry to prove myself. While Troy was off playing lacrosse at some private college, I was learning the business from the ground up, filing paperwork, cold calling prospects, driving Dad to client meetings in his beat-up Honda. By the time Troy graduated and joined the firm, I'd already established relationships with half our client base. Doctors who trusted me with their malpractice settlements, lawyers who let me manage their retirement accounts, 3 old Boston families whose wealth went back to the shipping industry in the 1800s. These weren't flashy tech entrepreneurs looking for the next big score. They were people who valued consistency, integrity, and the kind of returns that compounded quietly over decades. Troy always saw that as a limitation. "We're leaving money on the table, Colin," he'd say whenever I'd recommend a conservative municipal bond over some venture capital scheme. "These trust fund babies have millions just sitting in savings accounts. We could triple their wealth in 5 years with the right aggressive strategy." But I knew our clients. Dr. Patricia Wynn didn't want to triple her wealth in 5 years. She wanted to know her retirement was secure and her daughter's medical school tuition was covered. The Blackwood Family Trust wasn't looking for explosive growth. They wanted preservation of capital that had survived the Great Depression, 2 world wars, and the 2008 financial crisis. That's where Troy and I differed. He saw dollar signs and growth percentages. I saw people. The cracks started showing about 6 months ago. Troy began scheduling client meetings without me, pitching new investment strategies that made me nervous. He'd come back from these meetings talking about cryptocurrency portfolios and hedge fund partnerships like they were guaranteed winners. When I'd ask for details, he'd wave me off with some comment about evolving the firm's vision. Then came the outside investors. 2 guys from New York with expensive watches and thin smiles. They'd sit in our conference room talking about market disruption and aggressive growth models, while Troy nodded along like their best student. Dad seemed uncomfortable with them, but he was already talking about retirement, and Troy had convinced him these were the kind of partners who could take Shepherd Capital to the next level. I started noticing other changes too. Phone calls that stopped when I entered the room. Emails I wasn't copied on. Documents that required only Troy's signature when they used to require both partners' approval. The morning Troy terminated my partnership, I wasn't surprised. Disappointed, maybe. Hurt that 23 years of partnership meant so little to him. But not surprised. What did surprise me was how calm I felt walking out of that building. I sat in my truck for an hour after Troy dismissed me. Not because I was devastated. I'd seen this coming for months. I sat there because I was calculating. 23 years of client relationships don't just belong to Shepherd Capital Holdings. They belong to the person who built them, nurtured them, earned the trust that makes them possible. Troy thought he was inheriting a client list when he took over the firm. What he was actually inheriting was my reputation, my relationships, and my word. That's when I realized what I had to do. 3 months earlier, during one of my routine reviews of our partnership agreements, I'd noticed something interesting, a clause buried deep in the limited partner documentation that gave certain high-value clients the right to redirect their investments immediately upon any change in senior management. It was standard language, the kind of protective measure wealthy families insist on when they're entrusting millions to an investment firm. Troy hadn't bothered reading the fine print. Neither had his New York investors. They were too busy planning their aggressive growth strategies to worry about contract details. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling through my contacts. Dr. Wynn, attorney Harrison Black from the Blackwood Family Trust. Margaret Foster, who managed the Pemberton estate. 6 families who represented over $87 million in managed assets. 6 families who'd trusted me personally for more than a decade. The first call was to Dr. Wynn. Patricia, it's Colin Shepherd. I wanted to let you know there have been some management changes at the firm, and I wanted to discuss your options under the partnership protection clause in your agreement. Her response was immediate. Are you leaving, Colin? I've been asked to step down from my partnership role. Then so am I. What do you need me to do? The conversation lasted 10 minutes. By the end, she'd agreed to transfer her entire portfolio, $12 million, to whatever firm I established next. The second call was to Harrison Black. Similar conversation, similar outcome. $15 million in trust assets, ready to move. By the time I drove home that evening, I'd made 6 phone calls and secured commitments for $87 million in transferred assets. Not bad for an afternoon's work. The beautiful part was Troy's timing. He'd terminated my partnership on a Friday afternoon, probably planning to announce his new vision for the firm on Monday morning. What he didn't realize was that gave me an entire weekend to execute the client notifications required by the partnership protection clauses. By Monday morning, Shepherd Capital Holdings would wake up to a very different reality. I started the truck and drove home to my wife, Julia. She was in the kitchen when I walked in, and she took one look at my face and knew something had changed. How bad? She asked. Actually, I said, I think it might be very good. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp October air that makes Boston feel alive. I was up at 5 a.m. drinking coffee and reviewing the legal documents I'd been preparing for months. By 7 a.m., I was already at the office of Patterson & Associates, the law firm that had helped me incorporate Shepherd Advisory Group 2 months earlier. The paperwork was simple. 6 asset transfer requests, each one perfectly legal under the partnership protection clauses Troy had never bothered to understand. $87 million moving from Shepherd Capital Holdings to my new firm before Troy even opened his office. I was back home by 9 a.m. when my phone started ringing. Colin, what the hell did you do? Troy's voice was tight with panic. I exercised my client's contractual rights, I said. Something you might want to familiarize yourself with. You can't just steal our clients. I didn't steal anything. I simply informed them of their options under the management change provisions in their agreements. They made their own decisions. The line went quiet for a long moment. When Troy spoke again, his voice had changed. Gone was the panic, replaced by something colder. You think you're clever, Colin, but you've made a serious mistake. Those clients signed contracts with Shepherd Capital Holdings. We have legal grounds to block any transfers. Actually, you don't. I wrote most of those contracts, remember? I made sure the protection clauses were ironclad. We'll see about that. I'm calling our lawyers. The call ended, and I knew Troy was about to make his first real mistake as managing partner. Within an hour, he'd be sitting across from expensive attorneys trying to find some way to claw back the clients he'd just lost. He'd spend thousands on legal fees, waste time he didn't have, and ultimately discover what I already knew. The contracts were bulletproof. But Troy's real problem wasn't legal. It was mathematical. Shepherd Capital operated on a management fee structure. We earned 1.5% annually on all managed assets, plus performance bonuses on successful investments. With $87 million walking out the door, Troy had just lost over $1 million in annual revenue. The two outside investors who'd backed his takeover weren't going to be happy about that. My phone rang again around noon. This time it wasn't Troy. Colin, this is Gerald. My father's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the tension underneath. Dad, we need to talk. Can you come to the office? I don't think that's a good idea. Troy made his position pretty clear on Friday. Troy isn't running this conversation. I am. I drove to the office wondering what kind of reception I'd get. The Shepherd Capital Holdings building was a converted brownstone in Boston's financial district, the kind of understated elegance that old money clients preferred to flashy glass towers. I'd helped Dad choose this location 15 years ago, back when we were moving out of the garage and into our first real office space. The receptionist, Kelly, looked uncomfortable when I walked in. She'd been with us for 8 years, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. He's waiting in the conference room, she said quietly. I found Dad sitting alone at the mahogany table where Troy had terminated my partnership 3 days earlier. He looked older than his 68 years, and I realized this whole situation was taking a toll on him. Sit down, Colin. I took the same chair I'd occupied on Friday, but this time the dynamic was different. Dad wasn't mediating between his sons anymore. He was trying to save his company. Troy tells me you've stolen our clients. Troy tells you a lot of things. The question is whether you believe them. Dad studied my face for a long moment. What did you do? I gave 6 clients the information they needed to make informed decisions about their investments. Information Troy should have provided when he announced the management changes. And they all chose to leave. They all chose to follow me. Dad leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in months he looked like the man who'd built this company from nothing. Tell me about these protection clauses, he said. I pulled out a folder I'd brought with me. Inside were copies of the 6 contracts that had just cost Troy $87 million. Page 4, Section 12, I said, sliding Dr. Wynn's contract across the table. Standard wealth protection language that every high net worth client insists on. In the event of a change in senior management, limited partners have the right to immediate asset reallocation without penalty. Dad put on his reading glasses and studied the document. I watched his face as he absorbed the implications. You wrote this clause into every major contract? Every one. You taught me to protect our clients' interests, Dad. This is what protection looks like. He closed the folder and looked at me with something that might have been respect. Troy doesn't know about these clauses, does he? Troy doesn't read contracts. He signs them and moves on to the next deal. But you've been planning this for months. I've been preparing for this possibility since Troy brought in the outside investors. When you announced your retirement, I knew what was coming. Dad was quiet for a long moment, processing everything I'd told him. When he spoke again, his voice was different. There's something you need to know about those investors, he said. Something Troy hasn't told you. I waited. They didn't just want a partnership stake in Shepherd Capital. They wanted to acquire us outright. The plan was to use our client relationships to bootstrap a much larger investment fund. Troy convinced them to start with a partnership arrangement, but the end game was always a complete buyout. The pieces started falling into place. Troy's aggressive expansion plans, the meetings I wasn't invited to, the rush to change the firm's investment philosophy. They were never planning to keep me around, I said. Troy convinced them you'd be a problem, too conservative, too attached to the old ways. They wanted someone who could deliver the kind of growth numbers that would justify their investment. And now? Dad almost smiled. Now they're looking at a firm that just lost 60% of its managed assets in a single morning. The growth projections Troy promised them are mathematically impossible. I understood then why Dad had called this meeting. It wasn't about family reconciliation or finding a way to bring me back into the fold. It was about survival. What are you asking me, Dad? I'm asking what it would take for you to consider returning those clients to Shepherd Capital. Under Troy's management? Nothing. What about under different management? I studied his face, looking for the angle I knew had to be there. The outside investors have an escape clause, Dad continued. If the firm fails to meet certain performance benchmarks in the first quarter, they can withdraw their investment and dissolve the partnership. Troy doesn't know about this clause. It was added to the agreement after he signed it. You're planning to force them out. I'm planning to give them a reason to leave voluntarily. The question is whether you'd be interested in rebuilding what we started. I thought about the 6 phone calls I'd made on Friday afternoon, the trust those clients had placed in me personally, not in the Shepherd Capital name, the new firm I'd already incorporated, the office space I'd already leased. I appreciate the offer, Dad, but I think it's too late for that. His expression told me he'd been expecting that answer. Then I guess we'll see what happens next. The call came at 6 a.m. Tuesday morning. Margaret Foster, who managed the Pemberton estate, was on the line. Colin, I just got off the phone with Harrison Black. He says you're setting up a new firm? That's right. Shepherd Advisory Group. We'll be operational by next Monday. Good. The Pemberton trustees met yesterday evening. We're ready to transfer the full portfolio, $28 million. But we have a request. I waited. We'd like you to consider taking on additional clients. We've been talking to some other Boston families who are concerned about changes in their current wealth management arrangements. That was how I learned about Troy's weekend. While I'd been setting up my new firm, he'd been making desperate phone calls to every major client, trying to convince them to stay with Shepherd Capital. His pitch had been aggressive, promising returns that bordered on impossible, and dismissing their concerns about the management changes. The old money families of Boston don't respond well to aggressive sales tactics. By Tuesday afternoon, I had inquiries from 4 additional families representing another $43 million in managed assets. Word was spreading through the quiet networks that connect Boston's wealth management community. Wednesday brought a different kind of call. Colin Shepherd? Speaking. This is David Morrison from Morrison & Associates. We represent Shepherd Capital Holdings. We need to discuss your recent client solicitation activities. I'd been expecting this call since Monday. I haven't solicited anyone, Mr. Morrison. I've simply responded to inquiries from former clients. Our understanding is that you actively contacted clients to encourage them to terminate their relationships with Shepherd Capital. Your understanding is incorrect. I contacted clients to inform them of their contractual rights under existing partnership protection clauses. Nothing more. We have documentation suggesting otherwise. Then you should review that documentation with someone who understands contract law. I'll be happy to provide copies of all relevant communications if you'd like to pursue this legally. The call ended quickly after that. Troy was grasping at straws, trying to find some legal angle that would force his clients back. But contracts are contracts, and I'd written good ones. Thursday morning brought news that changed everything. Kelly, the receptionist at Shepherd Capital, called me at home. Colin, I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I thought you should know. The 2 investors came in yesterday. They were in Dad's office for 3 hours. When they left, Troy looked like someone had died. What happened? I don't know exactly, but I heard raised voices. And this morning, Troy's been on the phone with headhunters. I think he's looking for a new job. I thanked Kelly and hung up, then sat at my kitchen table trying to piece together what had happened. The investors had probably run the numbers and realized their aggressive growth projections were impossible without the clients I'd taken. They were cutting their losses and getting out. That afternoon, I got a call that confirmed my suspicions. "Colin, it's your father. Can we meet?" We met at a coffee shop in Harvard Square, neutral territory away from the office. "The investors are out," Dad said without preamble. "They invoked their escape clause this morning." "And Troy?" "Troy is trying to salvage what's left, but without their backing, he doesn't have the capital to pursue the aggressive strategies he promised. He's essentially running a firm with 30% of its original client base and no growth prospects. What are you going to do?" Dad stirred his coffee slowly, thinking. "I'm going to make you an offer. One last time." Friday morning, exactly 1 week after Troy terminated my partnership, I was sitting in my new office overlooking Boston Harbor when my assistant knocked on the door. "Mr. Shepard, there's someone here to see you. Says his name is Troy." I found my brother in the reception area, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie askew. The confidence he'd radiated a week earlier was gone. "Colin, we need to talk." I led him into my office, noting how he took in the harbor view, the mahogany desk, the client photos already hanging on the walls. Shepard Advisory Group looked more successful in its first week than Shepard Capital had in its last year. "Nice setup," he said, but there was no admiration in his voice. "What can I do for you, Troy?" He sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. "I need those clients back." "Which clients would those be?" "Don't play games with me, Colin. You know exactly which clients, the Winds, the Blackwoods, the Pembertons. All of them. Those clients made their own decisions based on information they were contractually entitled to receive. The investors pulled out yesterday. Without them, I can't cover the overhead. The firm's hemorrhaging money." I studied my brother's face, seeing something I'd never seen there before. Genuine fear. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" "I'm asking you to come back. As senior partner, we can rebuild this thing together." "Under whose management?" Troy's jaw tightened. "Mine. I'm managing partner now." "Then you have everything you wanted. I don't see the problem." "The problem is I can't run a firm without clients, and the clients followed you." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence stretch between us. Through the window I could see the harbor where Boston's merchant families had built their fortunes 2 centuries ago. Old money, patient money, the kind that valued relationships over quick profits. "You terminated my partnership because you said finance requires aggressive personalities," I said finally. "You were right about that. So you'll consider coming back?" "No, Troy. I'm saying you're about to discover just how aggressive I can be." The Shepard Capital Holdings building went up for sale the following month. Troy tried to keep the firm running with the remaining clients, but the numbers didn't work. Without the steady revenue from long-term wealth management contracts, he couldn't cover the overhead of a financial district office and a full staff. Dad called me when Troy finally admitted defeat. "He's shutting it down," Dad said. 25 years, and it's over." "I'm sorry it came to this." "Are you?" I thought about that question. Was I sorry my brother had destroyed the company our family had built? Yes. Was I sorry he'd learned that actions have consequences? No. "I'm sorry Troy couldn't see past his own ambition," I said finally. "What about you? Any regrets?" I looked around my office at Shepard Advisory Group. 6 months after opening, we were managing over $130 million in assets. 3 of the senior staff from Shepard Capital had joined us, along with 2 junior analysts who'd been frustrated by Troy's erratic management style. We'd outgrown our initial office space and were planning to move to larger quarters in the spring. "No regrets, Dad. This is what I should have done years ago." 2 weeks later, I got a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a photo from the Shepard Capital Holdings Christmas party 3 years earlier. Troy and I were standing together behind Dad, all 3 of us smiling at the camera. On the back, someone had written, "Before it all went wrong." I studied that photo for a long time, remembering the man Troy used to be before ambition corrupted his judgment. Then I filed it away in my desk drawer. Some bridges once burned can't be rebuilt, but sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen. The past was behind me now, and the future looked remarkably clear. Building something with integrity takes time, but destroying it with arrogance happens remarkably fast.